So welcome back to this first module on concepts. We're going to talk about those fundamental terminology, the concepts that sit underneath recovery and renewal. And so David and I will take you a little bit through that, some of that terminology that's already available within ISO 22393. So first, however, we want to put that terminology into some context. And the context, of course, is COVID. That's where we began the journey of developing ISO 22393. And recovery from COVID is going to be different, but why? And recovery is different for a number of reasons. One is that the scale is just it's different to what we've seen in the past and other emergencies, at least those that we've experienced in the UK. The flip-flop between response and recovery, having to move from response into recovery and then back again as different waves of the virus pandemic hit, it created very much an addictive pace that ran from response into recovery. And it meant that this sort of chronic fatigue set in on many of the people who were involved in recovery, because they were also the same people who were involved in response. And they were looking for direction, looking for national direction in many cases. But without that, there was a creation and an inventiveness at the local level as to how do they actually deal and recover from this health-led emergency. But there were, of course, other things, David, other parts.
Yeah, we very much experienced a disconnection, really, I think, at a number of levels. One between the kind of guidelines for recovery in the context of a prolonged, ongoing global pandemic, but also in the lexicon we used to describe that kind of health-led emergency. Some of the planning assumptions about how we would deal with pandemics were great for the response phase, but really it never explored what long-term recovery might require, what it might look like, and of course the reality of COVID has taught us so much more. But also the politics of how you actually manage those wider consequences at both national, subnational and then local level. You've got to factor in some of the impacts were so far reaching that it was clearly going to require democratic input, but the disconnect as to how those different levels can interact, I think, to provide direction and support. And then on a very practical, pragmatic level, the ability to share data. Given that this was such a personal disaster for people at the, on a very individual level, the ability of organizations to share important, instructive, informative data amongst each other to help prioritize those people who were vulnerable or all those people who have been disproportionately impacted, I think was challenged by a disconnect in our ability to do so.
Yeah, something else that was different, I guess, David, is that everybody was affected. It wasn't a flood where people over there were affected, or it wasn't an emergency where other people were affected, but not us. Everyone was affected. We all felt the vulnerability. We all felt the risk of COVID at our doorstep. And for many people, the way of dealing with that was to close the door and to shield. So recovery in that context means that everybody's recovering simultaneously. But this emergency, this crisis really exposed some of the inequalities that we see in our society. And different people were affected to different degrees by exactly the same crisis at the same time, which is very unique. But it did expose not just those inequalities, but exposed a failure of our systems, a failure of our preparedness at all sorts of different levels. And these different challenges have meant that recovery is going to be even more important and different.
A lot of opportunities for change, of course, because the positives of going to change the narrative of looking away from the deleterious impacts to look for some of the opportunities here. I think going back to Duncan's earlier point about inequalities, the one thing I think that most partnerships have realised is that those inequalities were existing, they're pre-existing. And the only way to truly tackle some of those disaffected or the disproportionately affected people is to really look again across a broad range of partnerships about how to deal with resilience in its widest, broadest sense into the future. But also that change of understanding that, this kind of pandemic is always going to be complex, and we need the skill sets to be able to be more flexible and agile, to be able to rise to the challenges that this kind of prolonged event will bring along with it. But clearly we think that there are, despite some fairly horrid effects and impacts for a lot of people and businesses, we think there are some unique opportunities for real resilience building and for positive change on the back of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, but those opportunities, are not going to be easily to deal with. There will be future waves, future outbreaks, future challenges, not just from the pandemic, but from other global events that are ongoing. There are still this sense of people being vulnerable, people being shielding or having to deal with their own personal responses to the pandemic. And there's still high demand and growing demand for many resources, for many services, and having to try and deal with that at the same time as thinking about economic challenges, as thinking about all the other things that are going on in the world, does make recovery and renewal even more challenging.
Yeah, and if you think about some of the concurrent events, there's a real need after about 6 months into the first wave of COVID to start thinking about what if there's another emergency happens tomorrow. And sure enough, around the globe, we started to see all sorts of, natural or man-made disasters unfolding. So having to deal with all of this, the response and the recovery to COVID at the same time as thinking about some of those additional threats clearly became a particular challenge to people trying to work out where their priorities lay. Getting people back to safe working practices, improving infrastructure to allow safe travel, safe intermingling, the ability to sit in an office and do your job rather than being at home. And also the fact that we were still learning as we were going through the last 2 years about what we've called hidden or indeed emerging new needs as some of those disaffected people, disproportionately parts of our society came to the fore of our thinking. But a lot of learning around resilience, I think, Duncan.
Yeah, and around what makes resilient infrastructure, what makes a resilient supply chain, looking at some of the social capital that's been created during the emergency, during the crisis, and thinking about how volunteering has changed, and volunteering during crisis has changed. Thinking about what all of this means for resilience, and how do we build new foundations, because the foundations that resilience was previously built on have been shown to be insufficient. The crisis has taught us and has exposed the fragilities that we've talked about earlier on. And so we need new foundations, but what do those new foundations look like, and how can we future-proof them for pandemic as well as other risks and crises that we might experience?
If you go back to some of the basics around public protection, domestic violence, child abuse, for example, things that require society to be functioning normal for the kind of normal natural surveillance to protect people who are vulnerable to that kind of abuse, for example, were challenged throughout the pandemic. The need to start really talking about mental health service provision as people were suffering from isolation, some of the ongoing well-being challenges throughout the kind of prolonged periods of lockdown, I think we really came to a fore. And actually being able to support and help staff who'd been exposed to this on a constant, high profile basis over a period of time, I think is something that we really need to carefully think through into the future. But that initial strategy here in the UK of talking really about the three strands of health, economy and society, I think after 2 years we now understand that strategy has to be expanded to much more inclusive elements beyond health, economy, society, infrastructure, the way we live our lives, the way we work, the way services are delivered, the way we prepare for and work together across systems, across organizations and strategic partnerships to truly prepare for these, I think will become the focus for the next few years.
Absolutely. And, for was it maybe April, a couple of years ago, we started talking about recovery, renewal, resilience. And it was all focused on how do we recover to build resilience? How do we renew to build resilience? All with that aim of the creation of a stronger foundations for resilience and the stronger societal resilience as a consequence of what we've experienced during the pandemic. I guess under a recovery strand of that, we're looking at integrating partnerships across a much wider range of systems than we have seen in the past, and building resilience through that integration, recognizing that the emergencies that we've experienced in the past have not been COVID, and COVID has taught us the need to think much, much wider. That means we need new arrangements, for integrating those different audiences, those different partners. And we need a stronger capability and a stronger capacity to work with partners in much more creative and agile ways, to deal with the size of an event that was previously unthinkable. But that's just the recovery side. Renewal side, David, is obviously much, much wider than that.
Yeah, because of its nature, because this is much more aspirational, much more kind of transformational, then we strongly believe that that requires a degree of co-production you don't normally see during the response and recovery phases, for I think the time-limited reasons that you've got to deal with the emergency in the kind of here and now sense. But looking forward to change people's lives, to improve public service delivery, clearly, I think puts an implication on organisations to talk more to people who receive those services, involve them in the planning, involve people who can help, including the massive volunteer and community support that was available, for example, to design the new future, but also then truly get into some of the inequalities, the fragilities that we've spoken about in our previous slides. You know, look at a different way, a much more diverse way of managing some of those challenges, and then trying to balance the aspirations of renewal, of course, across the ongoing narratives, the fiscal constraints that we will continue to experience into the next few years, especially given current global issues.
And another opportunities around resilience and what that looks like. We much better understand what risk looks like, what resilience looks like, and how our societies and partners and supply chains and how they can all deal with that. We much better understand what is the capacity of local resilience and what is the capability of local resilience. So we understood that volunteers might come, but maybe not in the degrees and for the prolonged nature and for the diverse expectations on volunteers than we've seen during COVID. And all of this again comes towards these new foundations that we think will be built both in the UK and internationally, but as a result of the experience that we've had, the experience that individuals have had in understanding risk. You know, we've often talked about, we've seen a masterclass in risk communication. We've seen things happen as a result of that communication that we would never previously have imagined. These are all creating these new opportunities. So that was very much the context to these concepts in recovery and renewal. And David and I have been working a lot with local resilience forums in England, other organisations across the world, to think through what does recovery and renewal actually mean and how do you do it. And so what we're going to talk to you about today is how do you do it? What's the process that you can use to think through recovery and renewal? So we start off with the concepts, and then we'll move on in the next module, module 2, to setting up a recovery coordination group. This is a graphic that we're going to use throughout this series of modules. Module 3 will look at assessing impact and needs assessment so that you can understand what has been the loss, agree recovery activities, think through renewal initiatives, and then continuous improvement so that you can identify lessons around how you recover and renew and constantly integrate those so you're better prepared to recover and renew from the next emergency. This is the format of the international standard. It's the format of these modules. And but first we're going to take you through some of the key terms, and we'll start off, David, with recovery.
Yeah, so let's, as Duncan says, let's unpick some of the words that we're using here. So what's the difference between recovery and renewal? I'll start with recovery, and then Duncan will just expand on it and take you through what we mean by renewal in this context. So for us, recovery is a kind of relatively short-term set of activities that we think address the urgent fragilities and the immediate aftermath, normally, of a disaster, be it a man-made or a severe weather or indeed a health-led pandemic. They tend to be transactional activities that are all about dealing with the immediate consequences, but assuring preparedness for the next oncoming emergency, or indeed about restoring normal service operations within organisations that are critical to normal public life. It tends to include activities that need to be implemented around reflecting and learning. So taking a little bit of a pause to think about the response phase, what we learned from it, to appreciate what people have done, and where appropriate to recognise and remember both people's loss, but also the effort of everybody who came together. It is about reviewing preparedness. So literally, how will you be ready for the next crisis, even if you're still dealing, because indeed we have done with COVID, on a very prolonged wide area challenge. Restoring those operations we've mentioned around services that were exposed or indeed had to be halted to reprioritise the way that staff were deployed. And then importantly, to start to think about some recommendations for the opportunities that renewal may present. So in summary, we think recovery is very much about preparedness, being ready to respond to a future incident. And in a little bit more detail, I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them are kind of build on the first slide. But the last three, I think, are important. With the pace of how you do recovery, given that it's very close to the immediate aftermath of an emergency or a disaster, will clearly depend on any ongoing or prolonged demands of the actual emergency phase, backlogs created by some of the disruption to services, or indeed the reprioritising of the way things are done. The fatigue that Duncan mentioned to you earlier on, of people who've maybe been doing this now for a considerable amount of time, who need a little bit of a pause, a little bit of downtime, and then indeed even basic things like supply difficulties arising from the emergency itself. Normally we'd say that recovery is planned in advance. It's absolutely normally possible to start thinking about recovery on the same day the disaster occurs itself. In fact, it's quite essential that you start thinking about recovery as soon as possible. But we think this is applicable for all levels of society. So recovery can be managed both at national government level, right the way through to individual families, individual people, businesses, organisations and partnerships. Duncan, and renewal.
Yeah, so whilst recovery is absolutely critical, what we've seen is that people get really excited by renewal. So renewal, this really complex, very ambitious change of society. This, as David's already said, this very much requires co-production. So it requires involvement of society in developing strategies for transformational change. So it's about how do we build resilience in infrastructure, dealing with inequalities, to climate change. How do we build resilience based on some very ambitious initiatives that we want to invest in our society? So here are some of these initiatives might cross people. So providing support to those people who have found to be vulnerable, trying to reconcile some of the challenges that they've had and provide reparations to them. How do you have initiatives within certain places? So how do you regenerate places? How do you look at processes and reshape or reorganize processes? Really looking at some of these really big challenging issues across people, place, processes, and trying to repair those so that for the next emergency that you experience, there are less challenges for each of those different aspects. So here resilience is very much about creating a system where there is an ability to absorb, to adapt in an environment that you find to be changing, and sometimes not changing for the better. Again, like David, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to pick up on what it says in the middle of this. Is these are very complex, interwoven processes, social, developmental, political, financial. These are incredibly intractable problems where what you're trying to do is understand the problems from many, many different perspectives, which is why you need to involve a wide variety of people, whether it's paid members of staff in local government, whether it's community groups, voluntary sector, elected members, is making sure that different perspectives are reflected so that the renewal is one that is informed by those different perspectives. And so involvement is absolutely key there. But David, obviously it involves different parts of the system.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, I think we've already explained to you, everybody has a role to play here, depending on the scale and the nature of the incident, of course. Some may be very localized, but most of the nature, certainly, of COVID and a pandemic will require, intervention activities and support, cooperation, collaboration, right the way from national government, national ministerial government departments, right the way through to subnational or national organisations like the Environment Agency, etc., right the way down to local communities. And I think the last three are probably the most important for us: local communities, individual organisations, and individual members of the public. Everybody has a role to play, we believe, in contributing towards recovery and most certainly towards renewal.
So those are some of the initial concepts that we'd like to raise with you. There are more concepts there in the international standard, as we've said, ISO 22393. We're not going to go through them at the moment. I feel that that's probably a good place to give you a grounding in what the modules 2 through to 6 will cover. So with that, we'll close this module and look forward to seeing you in the next module.